Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today we are tackling a genuinely massive, literal desert-sized topic, the incredibly complex and fascinating adaptation of Frank Herbert's sci-fi masterpiece, Dune. For decades, fans have debated, dreamed, and honestly theorized about how to perfectly capture the sprawling sands of Arrakis. Denis Villeneuve finally gave us this awe-inspiring, epic realization with his two films. But adapting a nearly 600-page text, one that is just packed full of internal monologues, deep ecology, and incredibly dense politics, well, it means making some major, sweeping changes. So we're going to break down exactly what changed, what got left behind, and why those specific decisions were made to bring this entire universe to a modern cinematic audience. Okay, let's take a super quick look at our roadmap. We're going to hit 6 key areas: adapting the unadaptable, streamlining the universe, Paul, Chani, and prophecy, sisters, mothers, and mentors, shifting themes and politics, and finally, the final verdict. All right, Section 1, adapting the unadaptable. So, Frank Herbert's 1965 novel has long been considered the holy grail. Actually, scratch that. It's more like the white whale of science fiction cinema. Why? Well, the book is incredibly reliant on internal monologues. We're constantly reading characters' private thoughts just to understand their true, often deceptive motivations. On top of that, there's this intensely complex web of feudal politics, ecological science, and psychedelic prescience. Translating a character literally just thinking about a prophecy into a compelling visual sequence without relying on constant, heavy, boring voiceover is a monumental task for sure. Moving right along, Section 2, streamlining the universe. To make all this massive lore actually digestible for people sitting in a theater, the filmmakers had to seriously trim the fat. The sheer volume of characters and subplots completely omitted from the screen just to maintain cinematic pacing is wild. We don't see the spacing guild at all, because honestly, including them would have added an entire extra layer of political convolution to a space opera that's already complicated enough. We lose Thufir Hawat's extended arc as a captive Mentat working against the Harkonnens from the inside. Count Fenring, the Emperor's deadly assassin best friend, absent. We also lose Hara, Jamis' wife, who eventually becomes Paul's servant and protects his sister in the books. And perhaps most shockingly for book readers, the film entirely cuts Paul and Chani's firstborn son, Leto II, who suffers a really tragic fate in the novel. Now, this timeline comparison brilliantly illustrates exactly why those cuts were so necessary. The movie undergoes a massive structural shift by completely removing the book's 2-year time jump. In the text, Paul spends roughly 2 years with the Fremen before the big climax. In the film, that whole period is compressed to less than 9 months. This single, absolutely crucial choice explains why Paul and Chani simply don't have time to have a child, and why Paul's sister, Alia, is still in the womb by the film's end. It keeps the momentum relentless and the narrative focus incredibly tight. Let's jump into Section 3, Paul, Chani, and prophecy. When we start comparing the page to the screen, Paul's core character really shifts. On the page, Frank Herbert gives us a protagonist who is cynically detached. Because of the omniscient narration, we literally see Book Paul actively and calculatingly using the Bene Gesserit myths to his political advantage, all while fully knowing the devastating jihad it might trigger. But on screen, Villeneuve frames Paul much more as a traditional reluctant hero. He genuinely fears the prophecy and actively resists his terrifying destiny before finally giving in. The cinematic Paul embodies the whole hero's journey far more directly, kind of hiding that cynical manipulation deep down inside. So to really understand Chani's massive shift in the films, we first need to define a specific term from the novel, Sayadina. In the books, Chani is a devout Sayadina. This is essentially a Fremen religious role, kind of like a reverent mother-in-waiting. Her entire life is deeply, fundamentally intertwined with Fremen religious belief. Now contrast that definition with her on-screen counterpart. Book Chani believes in Paul's messiah status completely and stands loyally by his side, even accepting her role as a mere concubine when Paul politically marries Princess Arulin. But Zendaya's Chani on screen, she is completely stripped of that religious devotion. The crucial point here is that movie Chani basically serves as an audience surrogate. She views the Bene Gesserit prophecy with deep suspicion, actively challenges Paul, and ultimately walks away from him in total heartbreak and defiance when he fully embraces his power. Instead of being a Sayadina, movie Chani identifies proudly and purely as a Fedaykin. These are the Fremen death commandos, absolutely the strongest and most skilled warriors on the planet. By making this specific change, the film really emphasizes Chani's deep, grounded ties to the physical survival of her people, completely separating her from the shadowy religious manipulation happening all around her. Moving on to Section 4, sisters, mothers, and mentors. First up, we've got Lady Jessica. In the novel, a really major subplot involves Jessica being suspected by both Gurney Halleck and Thufirhawat as a Harkonnen traitor, and she is initially highly cautious of Paul's burgeoning, terrifying power. But on screen, she is cleared of that traitor suspicion almost immediately. Plus, the movie significantly accelerates her machinations. Screen Jessica basically becomes the primary aggressive driver of Fremen religious fervor, deliberately pushing the fundamentalists in the South to practically worship her son. And then there's Alia, Paul's little sister. On the page, because of that 2-year time jump we talked about, she is born and grows into a highly intelligent, knife-wielding toddler who just deeply creeps out everyone around her. On screen, she remains an unborn fetus, communicating telepathically with her mother, eventually appearing to Paul in his spice vision as an adult. The writers actually noted the cinematic justification here, and it makes total sense. Trying to execute a hyper-intelligent, fighting toddler in a live-action movie would have seriously risked being incredibly distracting and unintentionally comedic. Keeping her telepathic grounds the film's serious tone perfectly. So, because Alia isn't born yet, one of the story's biggest climactic moments had to shift. In the book, it's literally the toddler Alia who strikes down her grandfather, Baron Harkonnen, with a poisoned needle. But in the film, the Baron is killed by Paul. This is a massive change. Shifting this kill keeps the movie's focus strictly on Paul's descent into ruthless power. It also leaves some really massive questions about how the future of the film franchise is going to handle Alia's psychological storyline, which in the books is heavily tied to the fact that she murdered the Baron. Oh, and we absolutely can't forget Gurney Halleck. Book Gurney never actually gets to fight the Beast Raban and spends a good chunk of his reunion with Paul trying to kill Lady Jessica over that false traitor suspicion. But on screen, oh, it is so satisfying. Gurney finally gets his cinematic revenge by stabbing Raban right in the throat during the final battle. Plus, and this is an incredible treat for the fans, Denis Villeneuve made it a priority to ensure Josh Brolin actually got to play the balisette. That's Gurney's beloved musical instrument, proving he really is the poet-warrior the books described. Let's transition into Section 5, Shifting Themes and Politics. So, some academic analyses have pointed out an erosion of political messaging in favor of a more traditional hero's journey in the films. Scholars note that Frank Herbert's original text deeply embedded Middle Eastern and North African, or MENA, cultural influences, granting the Fremen a ton of agency in their own political decisions. The critique of the film adaptation is that by omitting certain internal monologues and streamlining the plot to focus purely on Paul's individual exceptionalism, the movie leans pretty heavily into a standard Hollywood white savior epic format. This potentially downplays the complex cultural agency that was so present in the original text. And that brings us to this brilliant quote from Frank Herbert himself. He said, "The difference between a hero and an anti-hero is where you stop the story." This perfectly encapsulates the ongoing debate over Paul Atreides. Is he a genuine messiah saving a planet, or is he a dangerous, charismatic conqueror leading billions into a holy war? Because the movie cuts off before we see the full terrifying aftermath of Paul's reign, which gets explored in the later books, casual viewers might mistakenly walk away viewing Paul purely as a triumphant hero, totally missing Herbert's stark warning. Ultimately, this creates a pretty stark thematic divide. On the page, Dune is a harsh, cynical critique of charismatic leaders, imperialism, and the dangers of the white savior myth. Herbert wants you to be afraid of Paul's ascent. The screen version, however, is designed as a visceral, emotional spectacle. By focusing so heavily on individual exceptionalism and destiny, the sheer cinematic awe of the film sometimes softens the harsh political warnings woven throughout the book. We feel the triumph of the visuals, which can kind of mask the tragedy of the narrative. Finally, Section 6. The final verdict. We really have to ask this provocative question. Did Villeneuve's epic miss Herbert's point? By changing characters like Chani to be an anti-prophecy surrogate and stripping away layers of political machinations, did the film lose the soul of the book? Well, what's the verdict? Honestly, sacrificing some of that deep philosophical depth and internal narration was absolutely necessary to capture the visceral, cinematic spirit of the masterpiece. Denis Villeneuve removed what simply wouldn't work on screen, like the inner monologues, the talking toddlers, and the bloated space guilds, and replaced them with staggering, breathtaking visual storytelling. While some academic and political nuances were definitely streamlined, these changes successfully translated a famously unadaptable story into an undeniable cinematic triumph. It captures the essence, if not the exact letter, of Frank Herbert's vision. I'm going to leave you with this final, lingering question to think about. Which version of Chani's ending do you actually prefer? Do you prefer the devout, loyal companion of the page who stands by Paul's side no matter what, or the fiercely independent skeptic of the screen who walks away into the desert, absolutely refusing to bow? It's a change that completely redefines the emotional core of the entire story. Think about it. Dive back into the books and let the spice flow. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.